All right, now we're going to be talking about the classes of chordates, class chordata. We're looking at this part of the hierarchy of classification now. We're at class. And this is the most specific that we're going to get, is by looking at the different types of chordates. So remember that we're in the domain Eukaryota, in the kingdom Animalia, now in the phylum Chordata. We're going to look at the different types of chordates. Each of these classes that we're going to go over can be further classified into order, families, genus, and species, but we're not going to get that specific. Remember that animals are multicellular eukaryotes who do not have a cell wall. They're heterotrophic, meaning that they must eat other organisms for their energy and their nutrients. The animal kingdom is the largest kingdom with 1 million known species, though the number of these known species is likely an artifact of human bias towards studying animals. And just to remind you, we should know this stuff already, these being the phyla of animals. And so we're going to be looking at chordates, which means that if we're looking at this tree, at the bottom, the chordates would be multicellular. They would have tissues. They have 3 germ layers. They develop a protostome. They have a coelom, which is like a digestive tract. And then we're going to be looking at chordates, which are deuterostomes. Remember, that means that their anus forms before their mouth. All chordates are bilaterally symmetrical deuterostomes, and they possess a notochord. A notochord is a nerve cord that runs along the backside of the animal. Vertebrates are a special type of chordate who surround the notochord with vertebrae. They have a vertebral column. And most chordates are vertebrates, but there are a few who are not. Chordates form a phylum of animals that are defined by having at some stage in their lives all of the following anatomical features. There's 4 of them. A notochord, which is a fairly stiff rod of cartilage that extends along the inside of the body. And then those chordates who are vertebrates form a subgroup where the notochord develops into the spine. A dorsal nerve cord, in fish and other vertebrates this develops into the spinal cord. Pharyngeal slits, which are openings in the pharynx. This is the part of the throat immediately behind the mouth, and these slits extend to the outside environment. In fish, these slits are modified to form gills, but in a lot of other chordates, they become part of like a filter feeding system. In most terrestrial animals, like us, the pharyngeal slits are only present during embryonic development, and those pharyngeal slits develop into our inner ear bones and jaw. A post-anal tail is also present in chordates. This is a muscular tail that extends backward behind the anus. In humans and other apes, the post-anal tail is present during embryonic development, but it is vestigial as an adult. You have essentially the remnants of that tail, a few fused vertebrae at the end of your spine that we call the coccyx, or your tailbone. One quick thing, the difference here between notochord and nerve cord, make sure you understand. The notochord is our stiff rod of cartilage, so the notochord doesn't have any nerves in it. It's the nerve cord that usually rides atop the notochord that actually where all the nerves come out of. Animals first came about, or I should say, they really blew up in around 541 million years ago. This was the most intense burst of evolution that we know of. with the history of life on Earth. It's called the Cambrian Explosion, and it saw an incredible diversity of life emerge. Many of the major animal groups that are alive today, such as fish, emerged, and among the animals that emerged were the chordates. So the first chordates came around or evolved around 541 million years ago. And then you can see all the diverse life that comes after in terms of animals. Okay, in phylum Chordata, there's 3 subphylums. We're really going to focus on the subphylum Vertebrata, the one where they have vertebrae. But there are Urochordata and Cephalochordata. These are the only 2 organisms under Chordata that only have a nerve cord and don't have a spine. So tunicates, which they look a lot like sponges in a way, but they have a lot more to them than a sponge. They have a cellulose-like carbohydrate material called the tunic that covers the outer body. And although tunics are classified as chordates, only the larval form possesses all 4 common structures. Most tunicates live a sessile existence on the ocean floor, meaning that they're stuck in one spot, and they're suspension feeders. So they'll take in food through one hole, filter it, and digest that food in here. Lancelets possess a notochord. It's a dorsal hollow nerve cord. They have pharyngeal slits and a postanal tail in the adult stage. They don't really have a true brain, but the notochord extends into the head. They're only a few centimeters long, and they're usually found buried in sand at the bottom of warm, temperate, and tropical seas. All right, let's focus on vertebrates now. So vertebrates display the 4 characteristics of chordates that we just mentioned, but they're named for a series of bony vertebrae joined together as a backbone. In adult vertebrates, the vertebral column replaces the embryonic notochord. There are 7 classes of vertebrates: Agnatha, or the jawless fish; Chondrichthyes, or the cartilaginous fish; Osteichthyes, or the bony fish; Amphibia, Reptilia, Aves, and Mammalia. The 5 that you need to be familiar with are the bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And again, you can kind of see how animals have evolved. Up here we have the tunicates on this branch who don't have a vertebrate. But as you move up, these animals have vertebrae, like the hagfishes. Then jaws and paired appendages evolved, which gave rise to sharks and other types of fish. Then lungs evolved, which gave rise to lungfishes and amphibians, as well as 4 limbs. And then an amniotic egg evolved, which gave rise to reptiles. This means that you can lay eggs outside of the water. And then endothermy, which is warm-bloodedness, evolved twice, both in birds and in mammals. To be an endotherm, which means you're warm-blooded, you generate a lot of your body heat by burning food. Whereas these creatures up here, the reptiles, the fish, the amphibians, who are cold-blooded, the way that they generate heat is they need to bask in the sun. Okay, so just for your information only, you don't need to know this. These fish here, the 3 vertebrate classes of fish, the most primitive one is Agnatha. It's jawless fish that don't have scales. They include lampreys and hagfish. Fish that have skeletons that are made out of cartilage rather than bone belong to the class Chondrichthyes, and they include the sharks and rays. And really the only one that you need to know about are the bony fishes, which are usually what you think of when you think of a fish. These belong to the class Osteichthyes. Tuna, bass, salmon, trout, they're all examples of Osteichthyes. Okay, so again, looking at this tree, Osteichthyes, because they're here, they would have a vertebrae, and they would have jaws and paired appendages. But they wouldn't have lungs just yet, or at least not unless you're counting the lungfish. Some traits of bony fish. For their skin, they have scales. For gas exchange, they need oxygen, and they get oxygen that's dissolved in the water through their gills. They do external fertilization, where the females will lay the eggs, usually on some substrate like sand or mud, and then the males will deposit the sperm on top of the eggs. There are no limbs, and like I mentioned earlier, they're cold-blooded, which we call ectothermic, meaning that their body temperature is not internally regulated. It's dependent on the environment's temperature. So if they want to get warm and be able to move about, a lot of times they have to absorb some sunlight, absorb some heat from another source. All right, after lungs and 4 limbs evolved, we have the amphibians, of which there are 3 subclasses. Amphibians include frogs, salamanders, toads, newts, and some less familiar animals such as the caecilian. This is a caecilian right here. It looks like a giant worm with little legs and eyes and a mouth. Some traits about amphibians: their skin is very permeable, which is why they're at such a risk for pollutants in the water, because the water goes right through their skin, and this allows liquids and gases to pass through it easily. They use their skin to help them breathe, since oxygen passes easily through it. And it means that amphibians lose a lot of water through their skin, which is why they have to live in moist habitats. They do have lungs, though, and some have gills. So gas exchange can be conducted through the skin, gills, and or lungs. As amphibian larvae develop, these gills degenerate, paired lungs develop, and the metamorphosizing larvae begin making excursions to the water surface to take air breaths. So like with a frog, when you have a tadpole that hatches from an egg, it only has gills. It doesn't have lungs yet. It also has this postanal tail, as you can see that chordates have. As it metamorphosizes into a froglet and eventually a frog, it loses the postanal tail and it loses the pharyngeal gill slits and instead grows a pair of lungs, which is why adult frogs can go from water to land back and forth, but the tadpoles can only stay in the water. Reproduction is either external, which is outside of the female's body, or internal, within the female's body. Amphibians do not produce eggs with a shell, so their eggs have to be in water. In here you can see a bunch of amphibian eggs behind these 2 frogs who are copulating and doing fertilization. They do have 4 limbs, so they're what we call a tetrapod. Tetra meaning 4, pod meaning feet, 4 feet. And they're also ectothermic, meaning that their body temperature is not internally regulated. It's dependent on their environment. Next, animals evolved what we call an amniotic egg, and that led to the reptiles. Reptiles have thick, scaly skin that they shed. They do gas exchange through their lungs, so they don't have permeable skin like the amphibians did. Most reptiles have internal fertilization and produce an amniotic egg, which usually has a leathery shell that protects the embryo from drying out. So this is an actual shelled egg that can be laid on land. It doesn't have to be laid on water. And that was a great adaptation for reptiles who moved on to land. They have 4 limbs, and they're also ectothermic, meaning that they have to bask in the sun to warm up, to be able to move around. Miss von Bargen's favorite reptile, the turtle. This is a giant sea turtle, and she did some research with them with some IB students in the past. Where they went, I'm not sure if they went to Costa Rica or Mexico, but they helped document the baby sea turtles that were hatching, which is an extremely endangered species. Beautiful creature. Look how big the adults get. And there's a little baby. The babies have to make their way from the sand where they're born to the ocean. Most of them don't make it. They get picked off by predators or with human interference, with all the lights around. Sometimes they get turned around and head toward the city lights when they're supposed to be heading toward the moonlight on the water. Here's a turtle actually laying eggs. I don't know if you can hear the computer sound or not because I had that turned off. But there's not much sound going on. You see the eggs right there? They lay quite a few eggs, again, because most of them don't survive. All right, birds, which are a break-off group of reptiles. A lot of people think that dinosaurs have gone extinct, but in fact, birds are really a type of dinosaur. They share a lot of the same characteristics as dinosaurs. They're just the dinosaurs that didn't go extinct, that stayed around after the KT mass extinction event. So a little bit about birds, also called aves. Their skin produces feathers. They do gas exchange through their lungs. They reproduce internally with their fertilization. And then they produce an amniotic egg with a calcium carbonate shell that protects the embryo from drying out. They have 4 limbs. 2 of the limbs are wings, which may be used for flying. The other 2 are legs. And like mammals, they're endothermic, meaning that their body temperature is internally regulated, and it's maintained by burning energy in the forms of carbs and lipids. So like I said a minute ago, since we now know birds to really be an offshoot of the surviving dinosaurs, they're really now considered to be reptiles. And this traditional 7-class of vertebrate system is considered outdated now, as genetic and fossil evidence indicates that birds are reptiles, not their own distinct class. And as I mentioned, they're descendants of theropod dinosaurs. Theropod are 2-legged, mostly carnivorous dinosaurs. Archaeopteryx is a great example of a transition fossil between what we know of as dinosaurs and birds. It was the first fossil found that had impressions of feathers in it. All right, and then we have mammals. And with mammals, you can see they have evolved all these traits as well as endothermy. Now, we think that endothermy evolved in 2 separate occasions, once in mammals and once in birds. So I don't want you to think that birds descended from mammals or vice versa because they share that trait. We think it evolved independently. So mammals have hair on their skin. They do gas exchange through a pair of lungs. They have internal fertilization. Most have live birth, but there are a class of mammals called monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals. And they nourish babies with milk produced by their mammary glands. That's where the mammal name comes from, are the mammary glands. They are 4-limbed, so they're tetrapods, and they're also endothermic, meaning their body temperature is internally regulated by burning energy from the food that they eat. And the echidna is Ms. von Bargen's favorite mammal.